Veteran and his dog found a hidden bunker on his land. K9’s bark revealed a secret worth millions. The wind had died, but the silence that followed was heavier. Jack Moran stood ankle-deep in mud, his breath clouding faintly in the chill that lingered after the storm. The storm had passed hours ago, leaving a raw scar across his land. Downed trees, shattered fence posts, and the old oak that had stood for generations now lying in ruin across the center of his yard. But it wasn't the destruction that stopped him cold. It was Ranger. The dog had frozen mid-step. No bark, no growl, just stillness. His thick coat, soaked and clinging in dark patches, rose slightly along the ridge of his back. His amber eyes were locked on a patch of churned earth where the roots of the oak had been ripped out like exposed ribs. Jack narrowed his eyes. He knew this dog. Ranger wasn't easily spooked. 6 years as a mountain rescue canine, and not once had the German Shepherd hesitated in the face of storms, cliffs, or blood. But now he stood like a statue, ears pinned forward, breathing slow and tight. "What is it, bud?" Jack asked, stepping closer. His boot made a soft, unnatural click. Jack paused, frowned, and knelt. The roots were tangled, matted with wet clay, but something glinted beneath them. He cleared a patch with gloved fingers, brushing aside the muck. Metal. A flat, corroded surface, curved slightly, embedded deep in the earth. The shape was too clean, too deliberate. Jack leaned in, tapped it with the end of a stick. Hollow. Old. Ranger let out a low, vibrating whine, a sound Jack had only heard twice before. Once, during a landslide in Arizona, when a body was still breathing under the rubble. And once in a hospital hallway, outside Jack's father's room, minutes before the flat line. Jack's gut tightened. He pulled back more roots, scraping with bare hands now, ignoring the sting of broken bark and wet dirt. A rusted wheel, like a hatch valve, emerged from the roots. "You gotta be kidding me," he muttered. The wind picked up again, gentle this time, brushing past the ruined oak like a breath held too long. Ranger didn't move. His gaze hadn't wavered. Jack stood slowly, mud clinging to his jeans. He looked down at the exposed metal, the strange, deliberate shape tucked beneath what had always been just a tree. He'd come back to this land for peace, for quiet. And for a while, it had worked. He had buried his war in the trees, in the routines, in the stillness. But now the land was speaking again. And it was Ranger who had heard it first. He ran a hand over his stubble, the damp air clinging to his skin like memory. "All right," Jack said softly, eyes on the hatch. "Let's see what the hell you just dug up." Ranger's tail gave a slow, uneasy thump against the wet grass. A signal. A warning. A promise. The morning after the storm dawned sharp and cold. Jack was already up, a mug of black coffee cooling in his hand as he stood on the porch, staring at the twisted remains of the oak. The massive root system now lay tangled like the spine of some fallen beast, its muddy grave exposed in the center of his yard. Ranger paced the edge of the crater, nose low, body tense. Jack set down the mug and walked out, boots squelching in the soft, wet earth. The air still smelled of ozone and pine, a leftover echo from the storm's wrath. His eyes drifted toward the spot where they'd seen metal the day before. Ranger didn't wait. He leapt into the pit, landing with practiced ease. He sniffed once, twice, then began to dig. Fast, purposeful, dirt flying in heavy clumps behind him. "Whoa, easy," Jack said, sliding in after him. "You chasing squirrels or something real?" But deep down he already knew. There was something here, something wrong. Ranger didn't bark. He didn't need to. His focus was absolute. His body angled, tail stiff, paws striking the same patch again and again. When Jack knelt beside him, he felt it too, just beneath the roots, the smooth curve of cold metal, different from the rusted glimpse they'd found earlier. He cleared more mud, working with his hands. The outline emerged slowly, a rectangular hatch embedded horizontally into the soil. A thick, rusted wheel handle was centered on its face, encrusted with years of earth and time. Jack tried it with both hands. It didn't budge. "Figures," he muttered, brushing a streak of mud from his cheek. Ranger sat beside him now, chest heaving slightly, watching every movement. Jack climbed out of the pit, walked to the barn, and returned with a toolbox. He sprayed the handle with penetrating oil and set the can aside. Then he grabbed a small sledgehammer and struck the perimeter of the hatch, careful but firm, waking the metal with short, rhythmic taps to loosen the rusted seal. Ranger sat on the edge of the pit like a sentinel, ears up, gaze sharp. Not just alert, waiting. As Jack worked, he noticed something odd. The hatch wasn't just old. It was deliberate, well-built, industrial, not the kind of thing buried by accident. He pried at the wheel again. Still nothing. He repositioned, wedging a crowbar between the spokes and pulling with slow, measured pressure. The metal resisted. Then, with a long, grinding groan, it turned. Dust and flakes of rust drifted down like falling ash. Jack froze. He didn't know what he expected. A locked box? A septic tank? But the sound that followed, that low, deep click echoing beneath the ground, was not the sound of something ordinary. He gripped the handle, pulled. The hatch didn't lift easily. He strained, back tight, arms trembling. Then, finally, the door gave, tilting back on its hinges with a shudder and a muffled thud against the mud. Cold air poured out. It was thick with the smell of old concrete, metal, mildew, and something else. Stale time. The kind of air you only find in places forgotten by the world. Jack grabbed a flashlight and leaned in. A narrow stairwell disappeared into the earth, the concrete steps slick with moss and dampness. He exhaled, heart thudding with a mix of curiosity and unease. "Stay," he told Ranger, voice firm. The dog whined softly but didn't move. Jack descended slowly, boots echoing with each step. The air grew colder with every foot. The beam of his flashlight pierced the darkness, illuminating a narrow passage that opened into a small room. Concrete walls, low ceiling, no windows. A bunker. It wasn't a root cellar. This was military, intentional, a relic from another time. Against the far wall sat a metal desk, its surface coated in dust an inch thick. A shortwave radio, dark and silent, hunched like a fossil from a forgotten war. Shelves lined one side of the room, mostly empty. In the corner, a folding cot, mattress rotted through. Jack stepped carefully across the room, every creak of his boots magnified in the silence. Then he saw it, a green ammunition box shoved beneath the desk, half covered in old blankets. He crouched, pulled it free. It was heavy. He clicked open the metal latches. Inside, packed in yellowed cloth, lay a single leather-bound journal and an envelope marked with faded ink. The writing was shaky but familiar. Jack. His chest tightened. He carried the box back up into the daylight. Ranger met him at the top of the stairs, tail wagging once before lowering again. Alert. On guard. Jack didn't speak. He walked back to the house, sat at the kitchen table, the box before him, the hatch still open behind them like a wound in the ground. The journal was old but solid. Inside, page after page of tidy handwriting dated over 50 years ago. It wasn't just a log, it was a record of something big, something secret. The entries started simple, weather, repairs, supplies, but then grew darker. Vague mentions of partnerships, clauses, investments, silence. Ranger lay at his feet, head on his paws, eyes tracking every flicker of emotion that crossed Jack's face. Jack flipped to the last few entries. "We buried it," the others insisted. "I didn't want to, but they said it was safer that way." Safer for who, I wonder now. Secrets don't sleep. They wait. He looked down at Ranger, who now sat up, head tilted. "You found it?" Jack murmured. "You knew something was wrong?" The dog didn't move, just held his gaze. Jack leaned back in the chair, fingers tapping the edge of the box. The piece he had come here to find was already gone. Ranger had unearthed more than metal. He had pulled on a thread buried beneath years of silence, and it was starting to unravel. The bunker was colder than Jack expected, the air so still it felt like he'd stepped into another time. He crouched beside the desk, wiping dust from his gloves as he dragged the heavy ammunition box into the light of his flashlight. The metal clanged softly against the concrete floor, a sound swallowed immediately by the thick walls. Ranger stayed at the bottom of the stairs, half in shadow, ears pitched forward, eyes locked on Jack. The dog didn't sit. He stood poised, weight balanced, as if the concrete itself unsettled him. Jack flipped the latches on the box. They resisted at first, then gave way with a dry snap. Inside, wrapped in a piece of yellowed oilcloth, was a dark, leather-bound journal and a folded sheet of rough paper, an old map drawn by hand. The leather felt warm despite the cold, like it had held on to the heat of the man who once carried it. Jack's thumb brushed over a faint embossing at the corner, the initials J.M. He sat down on the edge of the cot, the springs creaking beneath him. Ranger moved closer, his claws clicking softly on the concrete as he crept toward the west wall. His nose traced a slow line along the baseboard, pausing now and then to sniff with a sharp intake of breath. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Not loud, not a warning to Jack, a sound of tension. Jack opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was neat and familiar, the same script on old Christmas cards tucked in a box back at the house. His grandfather's voice, written in ink. At first it was the simple record of a rural life. Weather notes, repairs to the barn, shipments of lumber. But as Jack turned the pages, the tone shifted, the lines becoming clipped, guarded. He began to see names, no, initials. VC mentions of a project, partners, clauses, a shared enterprise that had to be kept quiet. Ranger's claws scraped against the concrete, the sound sharp. Jack glanced up. The dog was at the far side of the room now, right against the west wall, his nose pressed to the cold surface. His ears were back, tail low but stiff, eyes flicking between Jack and the spot on the wall as though trying to draw a line between the two. "What is it?" Jack asked, voice low. Ranger's growl deepened, but his body stayed steady. He didn't paw at the wall, didn't bark. He stood as if waiting for permission. Jack looked back at the journal, turning a few more pages. His grandfather wrote about secrecy and about an asset they had secured. The language was vague but urgent. One passage caught his eye, written in a hurried hand. "We've done it. V says the numbers will hold for decades. C pushes for control, says patience is weakness. I fear what we've buried may outlive us all." Jack's stomach tightened. Buried. The word jumped off the page. He shifted his grip on the journal, flipping to the folded map. It wasn't a surveyor's chart of the land. It was a rough drawing of a structure. No labels, just measurements and arrows. He looked up. Ranger had moved a few inches closer to the wall, his nose pressed hard enough that his breath fogged the concrete. The growl in his throat faded into a low whine. Jack stood, taking the flashlight with him. He crossed to the dog, crouched low, and ran his hand over Ranger's shoulders. The dog was quivering, not from fear, but from intensity. His gaze never left the wall. Jack raised the flashlight, casting its beam across the concrete. Nothing. just a blank expanse of poured grey. But the air here smelled different, a faint mustiness that made his throat tighten. He pressed his palm against the wall. Cold. Solid. Yet for some reason he felt the same sensation he'd had during patrols overseas when the silence got too deep and the ground felt hollow underfoot. A hunch, born of experience and now sharpened by the presence of the dog at his side. He looked down at Ranger. "You think there's more?" he whispered. Ranger blinked once, slow, then sat, tail still, gaze locked on the same patch of concrete. Jack straightened, the journal still open in his other hand. The final entries were different, short sentences, fragments of thought, written like confessions. One line in particular chilled him. "A secret is a debt, and one day someone will collect." He closed the journal, the sound loud in the bunker's silence. Ranger shifted, leaning lightly against his leg, a quiet weight. Jack exhaled, his breath misting in the cold air. He looked from the map to the wall, from the journal to the dog. The pieces didn't make sense yet, but the pattern was there. He could feel it. He knelt, laying the journal open on the floor, the map spread beside it. Ranger lowered his head, sniffing the paper once before returning his focus to the wall. The dog's body language wasn't just instinct. It was deliberate, purposeful, as if he knew he'd led Jack to the edge of something, and now it was up to Jack to take the next step. Jack's pulse quickened. The bunker, the journal, the initials V and C, his grandfather's cryptic warnings, all of it pointed to something more than an old fallout shelter, something hidden behind this wall. And whatever it was, Ranger could sense it. Jack stood, slipping the journal into his jacket. He gave the wall one last look, then met Ranger's eyes. "Good boy," he said quietly. Ranger's tail moved once, a single measured thump against the floor. Not relief, not excitement, just acknowledgement. They were on the trail now. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, carving golden lines through the wreckage left by the storm. Jack stood near the barn, stripping mud from his boots with the edge of a flat rock, when Ranger lifted his head from the porch and let out a single, low woof. Not a warning, not curiosity, recognition. Jack turned. A clean, dark sedan was easing its way down the gravel road, an unfamiliar shape out here, where trucks and rust were the norm. He narrowed his eyes. No one came here uninvited. No one just dropped by. Ranger rose slowly, body shifting from rest to readiness in one fluid motion. Jack let the scraper fall and walked toward the house. The car stopped a respectful distance from the edge of the porch. The engine cut. Silence returned for a beat, broken only by the ticking of the cooling motor. Then the driver's side, door opened. A woman stepped out, early 30s maybe. Tall, straight posture, smart hiking boots, dark green jacket, leather satchel slung over one shoulder. Her brown hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. Wire-rimmed glasses framed sharp eyes that scanned the property like she was taking mental notes. Jack stopped at the top of the steps, arms crossed, one hand resting unconsciously on Ranger's neck. The dog stood flush beside him, silent but coiled, like a spring waiting for a reason. The woman didn't flinch at the sight of them. "Mr. Moran?" she asked, stopping a few feet from the bottom step. "Who's asking?" Jack said flatly. "My name's Claire Whitman." Her voice was calm but direct. "I believe our grandfathers once knew each other." Jack blinked. He hadn't expected that. "Not likely," he said. "My grandfather died in the 70s, kept to himself, farmed, hunted, didn't have a social circle." Claire reached into her satchel slowly, carefully, not the way someone nervous around a man and his dog might, but deliberately, like someone used to being misunderstood and had prepared for it. She pulled out a clear folder and held it up. Inside was an old photograph, yellowed at the edges. 3 men stood shoulder to shoulder in front of what looked like Jack's house, only younger, brighter. Fresh paint. The slope of the porch unmistakable. The men were grinning, one with a hand on the other's shoulder. Jack recognized one of the faces instantly. His grandfather, but a much younger version, maybe mid-30s. My grandfather is on the left. Victor Whitman. Yours is in the middle. Thomas Moran. The third man. William Croft. The name landed hard. Croft. Jack had seen it. Scribbled in the journal beside fragments of warnings and regrets. Croft was the one who wanted control. The impatient one. The threat. Claire continued. After my grandfather passed, we found documents, papers I didn't understand until I cross-referenced them with public records, and with this location. She pulled out another sheet, this one printed more recently. Legal language. An agreement. This is a joint ownership contract signed in 1961 between our grandfathers and William Croft. It outlines a shared venture, an investment held in secrecy, with a sunset clause of 60 years. That clause expires in just under 3 weeks. Jack took the papers without a word. Ranger remained between them, head lowered slightly but unmoving. Claire kept her hands where Jack could see them. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said. "I just want to understand what our families were part of, what they built, and why it was hidden." Jack scanned the top page. The signature was unmistakable. His grandfather's full name, in strong looping cursive. Thomas Everett Moran. He didn't say anything right away. The weight of the journal in his back pocket suddenly felt heavier. Claire's eyes flicked toward the house. "May I come in?" Ranger let out a low huff. Jack's fingers curled instinctively on the scruff of the dog's neck, then relaxed. The storm hadn't just unearthed a hatch. It had shaken loose a secret no one was supposed to find. And now that secret had come knocking on his door. Jack stepped aside. Claire climbed the steps slowly. When she reached the top, Ranger gave her a long look, then stepped back 2 paces. A silent acknowledgement. Inside, Jack cleared the kitchen table. Claire laid out her folder. Legal documents, old letters, faded maps. Jack added his own. The journal. The hand-drawn sketch. The entries that had started cryptic and now began to sharpen into something terrifyingly real. They stood side by side for several long minutes, studying the pieces of a history that neither of them had written, but had both inherited. Claire broke the silence first. "My grandfather kept secrets, but he wasn't cruel. He loved precision, control. He followed rules. But this..." She tapped the contract. "This feels like desperation." Jack looked at her. "My grandfather wasn't desperate," he said. "He was proud, quiet, did what needed to be done." "Then maybe it wasn't his idea," Claire replied softly. Jack looked down at Ranger, who had positioned himself between them and the hallway, lying flat but with his head up, ears tuned. The dog's tail gave a faint tap against the floor. This wasn't over. Not even close. And somehow Jack knew. Ranger knew it too. The knock on the door wasn't hesitant. It was 3 hard raps, deliberate, demanding. Jack looked up from the kitchen table where the journal and documents were still spread between him and Claire. Ranger was already on his feet, tail stiff, gaze locked on the door. The dog didn't bark. He growled, low and deep, a vibration that started in his chest and never made it to his throat. Claire stood slowly. Jack gave her a sharp nod to stay back. He stepped to the window and peeled back the curtain. A black SUV idled in his driveway, polished and out of place. The sun caught the gleam of chrome rims and tinted glass. A man stepped out from the driver's side, then another from the passenger. Both were broad, clean-shaven, wearing fitted jackets, and that unmistakable stillness of men who had been trained to move only when ordered. Then the rear door opened. The man who emerged wasn't bulky. He didn't need to be. He moved like he owned the ground he walked on, measured, expensive shoes crunching on gravel, not caring they were coated in dust. His dark hair was neatly slicked back, his overcoat tailored to perfection, the collar standing just high enough to signal status, but not enough to seem vain. He scanned the property with thinly veiled contempt. Jack opened the door slowly. Ranger stepped in front of him, body rigid, muscles drawn tight like coiled rope. The man stopped at the base of the porch steps, flanked by his two shadows. "You, Jack. Moran?" he asked. Jack didn't answer. The man smiled. Cold, thin, calculated. "My name is Marcus Croft. I believe you're standing on something that doesn't entirely belong to you." Jack's hand rested on the door frame. "That so?" "It is," Croft replied. "My grandfather, William Croft, was a silent partner in a shared investment that includes this land and certain buried assets. I'm here to evaluate what was left behind." "This isn't a warehouse," Jack said, voice even. "And it sure as hell isn't open to inspection." Croft's smile didn't falter. "I'm not here for pleasantries. We both know something was uncovered. The legal clause is expiring soon. You have documents, I have documents. But the difference is, I came prepared to take action." He stepped forward. That's when Ranger moved. It was fast, precise. He didn't lunge, didn't snap. He simply shifted in front of Jack, blocking the porch stairs. His growl deepened into something primal. Ears flat, tail level. Teeth barely visible under a curled lip. Croft froze mid-step. So did the men beside him. Ranger didn't bark. He didn't have to. Every inch of his body said one thing clearly: "Come closer, and you will bleed." Croft's expression twisted, a flicker of annoyance breaking through his smooth mask. "It's just a dog," he muttered. "Then take the next step," Jack said, "and find out." The two bodyguards didn't move. Not because of Jack, because of the dog. They had seen aggression before, but this was different. Ranger didn't posture. He calculated. He read their stance, their breath, their hesitation, and waited for the moment he'd be allowed to act. Croft adjusted his coat. "I see we're at the threshold of civility. That's fine. I'll give you 24 hours to reconsider. After that, we stop playing nice." He turned without waiting for a reply and walked back to the SUV. The men followed, casting wary glances at Ranger before climbing inside. Jack didn't relax until the vehicle had backed out and disappeared down the road. Only then did Ranger drop the growl. He turned his head slightly toward Jack, breathing steady. Claire stepped beside them. "That was him, wasn't it?" she asked. Jack nodded. "The third partner, or what's left of him." They stood in silence for a beat. Then Jack crouched next to Ranger, placing a hand on the dog's chest. It was still tight, every muscle flexed. "You saw it before I did," Jack whispered. Ranger didn't look at him. His gaze stayed on the road where the SUV had vanished. He wasn't guarding territory. He was guarding Jack, and war had just been declared. The house had grown quieter since Croft's visit, but it wasn't peace. It was pressure, a storm without rain circling overhead. Jack paced the kitchen, journal in hand, flipping back and forth between entries he'd already memorized. Claire sat at the table with a legal pad, tracing lines on the old property map. Ranger lay by the back door, his head on his paws but eyes wide open, watching both of them like they were defusing a bomb. "He said the clause expires in less than 3 weeks," Claire said, tapping her pen. "That means Croft's been watching this place for months, maybe longer." Jack stopped pacing. "Then why didn't he move sooner?" Maybe he was waiting for you to find it first. Claire replied, or maybe he couldn't access it without you. Jack muttered under his breath and dropped back into the chair across from her. He set the journal on the table and flipped to the back pages, entries dated around 1963. The handwriting had changed. Tighter, rushed, less narrative, more fragments. Protective casing sealed. C suspects nothing. V confirms triangulation complete. Silence now. Silence is safety. Jack pointed to the margins. See those? 3 sets of numbers tucked neatly beside specific paragraphs. Not part of the main text, not labeled. Just 24N, 8E, 6S, 1W, 12W, 5N. Coordinates? Claire asked. Too short to be lat long, but they're directional, Jack said. North, east, south, west, it's a grid. Claire grabbed the property map, but the numbers didn't match any boundary lines. It doesn't fit the land layout. The distances don't make sense. Jack frowned. What if it's not a map of the land? Claire blinked. You're thinking inside the bunker? Jack nodded slowly. It's the only space that's tight enough, measured out like this. A confined grid. Claire stood, reached for her notepad, and started sketching. Assume the room is a 30 by 20 foot rectangle. If the reference points are different walls, and these numbers are distances from those corners, then it's triangulation. Jack finished. 3 vectors pointing to a single location. Ranger lifted his head. They spent the next half hour working through angles and offsets, measuring rough coordinates against the known layout of the bunker. Claire's hand moved quickly as she drew out the room again and again, overlaying the 3 directional points. Here, she finally said. If you take 24 feet along the north wall, 8 feet up, then 6 feet from the opposite south wall and 1 foot in, then 12 feet from the west wall and 5 feet up, they all converge here. She circled a section on her sketch, the middle of the west wall. Jack stared at it. Where Ranger wouldn't leave alone. He grabbed a flashlight and the sledgehammer. Claire followed him outside without a word. Ranger was already at the pit, standing at the bunker entrance before they even got there. The descent into the cold concrete room felt different this time. Not like exploring, but like returning to a question you'd been afraid to answer. Claire held the flashlight steady as Jack stepped to the west wall. It was blank, plain, just grey concrete, damp at the base, unbroken from corner to corner. He ran his hand across it. It felt solid. Then Ranger moved. He approached the wall slowly, nose working hard, sniffing along the floor's edge. His tail went low. A small whine escaped him. Then he began to scratch, not wildly but focused, his paws dragging methodically at a particular point along the lower half of the wall. Claire's voice was tight. That's exactly where the grid landed. Jack dropped to one knee, placing his hand against the wall beside the spot. I don't hear hollow. You wouldn't, Claire said. If it was reinforced, if it was meant to stay hidden. Jack stood and hefted the sledgehammer. Back up. Claire took Ranger's collar and moved to the far side of the room. Jack drew a breath, tightened his grip, and swung. The first strike echoed like a gunshot. Concrete splintered but held. Second blow, more cracks. A spiderweb of lines branched across the surface. Jack hit it again. On the 4th strike, the wall gave with a low, dull crunch. Dust spilled out of a fracture the size of a forearm. He dropped the hammer and reached into the opening, pulling loose chunks of crumbling concrete until a cavity was exposed. Inside, wrapped in tar-lined canvas, was a rectangular object. He pulled it free. A leather briefcase. Dark brown. Worn. Heavy. He set it on the work table, brushing the dust away. Its brass buckles were tarnished, but intact. The weight of it felt unnatural, like something more than paper lived inside. Claire whispered, Is it locked? Jack tried the latches. Both clicked open with soft resistance, but he didn't lift the lid. Not yet. Ranger moved beside him, close enough that his fur brushed Jack's leg. His tail thumped once, slow and solid. Not excitement, confirmation. Jack placed a hand on the dog's back. "You found it," he said softly. Ranger's ears twitched, but his eyes never left the case. Neither did Jack's. The suitcase smelled of aged leather and dust, as if it hadn't been opened since the Cold War. Jack clicked open the heavy brass latches, while Claire stood beside him, arms crossed tight against the autumn chill that had crept into the walls of the cabin. Ranger sat nearby, his gaze fixed not on the suitcase, but on the old radio in the corner of the room, like he already knew where this was going. Inside the case were rows of folders tied with red ribbon, stamped with foreign seals and typewritten codes, Swiss bank statements, offshore agreements, contracts with names long forgotten by history but powerful enough to shift continents. Jack ran his hand over a worn envelope marked Confidential, 1963. Claire picked up a manila file that held a photo. 3 men in military dress, one of them unmistakably Mateo Reyes, the man Jack's grandfather had claimed to serve under in the war. The founder, the ghost. At the bottom of the suitcase, beneath the documents and the faint smell of mildew, sat a small reel-to-reel tape. The label, almost faded into nothing. "MR at a confession." Claire turned to Jack. "We have to hear it." Jack hesitated, then nodded. "We use the old Grundig. It still works, I think." They placed the reel onto the deck of the vintage radio, its brushed steel knobs tarnished by time. The tape clicked, whirred, and hissed before a man's voice filled the cabin, grainy, old, and tired. It wasn't just any voice. There was something chillingly familiar about it. Gravely, slow, American with a slight southern drag. Jack's stomach dropped. The voice on the tape began. "I never wanted to kill him. Mateo trusted me. He brought me in when I had nothing, gave me the seat at the table, but then he got soft. Wanted to give it all away. To charity, to families. Said we owed the people. I couldn't let that happen. So I—" The voice cracked. Broke. "I buried the truth. I buried Mateo in a ravine outside Da Nang. No grave, just dirt and shame. I took the codes, I took the shares, built the company like he would have, except I kept the profits. All of it, and no one ever knew." The room went silent except for the low hum of the tape spinning to its end. Claire stared at the radio, her face pale. That voice— Jack stepped back like he'd been punched. "That was Charles Whitmore, my grandfather's partner, the man everyone said was a hero." Ranger let out a low, guttural growl, his ears twitching, eyes trained not on the radio now, but the door. Jack knelt down and looked Ranger straight in the eyes. "You hear that, boy?" Ranger's tail stayed stiff. His hackles bristled. He gave one soft bark. Just one. A warning. Claire's hands trembled as she picked up another document from the suitcase. A deed signed not just by Reyes, but 3 others. It was a transfer of ownership, all leading to one name— Claire's grandfather. But the signature of Charles Whitmore had been forged, sloppily, but enough to pass under a weary eye in 1963. This proves it. The company should have gone to Mateo's family." Claire whispered. "To mine. Not just yours," Jack added, lifting a second sheet tucked behind the deed. It bore his father's name too, handwritten in a ledger of trust fund beneficiaries, crossed out in red ink. A creak came from the front porch. Ranger shot up, snarling now. Jack moved to the window, saw a black SUV at the base of the drive. "Looks like Marcus Croft didn't take no for an answer," Jack muttered. Claire pulled the tape from the radio, slid it into her coat pocket. "We have to get this out, to someone who can do something." Jack looked at the suitcase full of damning evidence, then at Ranger, now positioned squarely between them and the door, ready. Then we move. Tonight. As they packed up, the truth hung thick in the air, heavier than any storm, sharper than any lie. Mateo Reyes hadn't disappeared. He'd been erased. And now, decades later, a German shepherd named Ranger, a stubborn veteran named Jack, and a woman searching for justice were about to bring it all back to the surface. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, Ranger didn't blink. The knock came just after sunrise. Ranger had already been awake, lying quietly by the front door of the cabin, his eyes trained on the porch before the first knock even landed. Jack was pouring coffee when he saw Ranger lift his head. Not barking, not growling, just watching, alert but calm. That alone told Jack something important. Whoever was on the other side of that door wasn't a threat. When he opened it, the wind carried in the scent of autumn pine and something else. Jasmine, maybe. Faint but distinct. The woman standing before him was small, older, wrapped in a wool shawl that looked handmade. Her eyes were soft but firm, and beneath the creases and silver-streaked hair was a face that had weathered decades of quiet battles. "You're Jack Whitmore," she said gently, her accent touched by Spanish roots. "I'm Lucia Reyes." Jack didn't say a word. Neither did Ranger, who had come to sit beside him now, silent as stone, tail still. Lucia nodded, as if she already understood the weight of that silence. "I think we should talk." They sat at the cabin table, old wood groaning beneath stacks of evidence and half-drunk mugs of coffee. Claire was there too, her arms folded, eyes flicking between the two as the woman told her story. "My grandfather's name was Mateo Reyes," Lucia began. "He was the founder, the real one. He didn't vanish. He was murdered." Jack stayed quiet, just listening. It didn't need to be said again. Lucia pulled a small photograph from her purse. It was faded, its edges curled, but the faces were clear. Mateo, young and proud in military dress, holding a child. Her father, Lucia explained. "He kept that photo hidden during the war. He never stopped writing letters to my father, but they stopped arriving after 1963. Her eyes met Jack's. "That's when he died, isn't it?" Jack nodded slowly. "The tapes prove it. He was killed by Charles Whitmore, my grandfather's business partner." Ranger shifted his weight subtly, eyes never leaving Lucia, but no tension in his frame. Acceptance. Jack noticed. "You came a long way," Claire said softly. Lucia looked at her. "I came for the truth. Not revenge, not money, just to put his name back where it belongs." She reached into her coat again and pulled out a worn envelope. Inside was a will, dated 1962, signed by Mateo Reyes and notarized. It named his son, Lucia's father, as the rightful heir to the company. But it had been buried in legal limbo for 60 years, discarded by those who had more to gain from silence. Jack stared at the document, then back at the tapes, the files, the suitcases full of what now felt like artifacts from a lie. "I spent most of my life thinking I inherited a legacy of honor," Jack said quietly. "Turns out it was built on a stolen grave." Claire touched his arm. "You didn't steal anything, Jack, but now you know the truth." Lucia stood, walking toward Ranger. She stopped a few feet away, then knelt down slowly. Ranger stepped forward and did something he rarely did with strangers. He rested his head gently against her knee. Lucia closed her eyes. "He knows," she whispered. Jack watched, jaw tight, heart pounding. In that moment he realized something he hadn't been willing to admit until now. This company, this land, this whole twisted legacy. It wasn't his, and maybe it never had been. Ranger turned to look at Jack. There was no judgment in those eyes, only the same calm presence that had walked with him through fire, rain, and blood. He was still with him, but now he stood beside Lucia too, because this wasn't about bloodlines, it was about truth. Jack rose from the table. He walked to the suitcase still open near the fire. He pulled out the deed, now crumpled at the corners, the ink smudged by time, and held it out to Lucia. "I don't know what the law will say," he said, "but this doesn't belong to me." Lucia looked at the paper, then at him. "You didn't take it, but you brought it back." Outside, the wind moved through the trees like the soft exhale of a long-held breath. Leaves fell, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a hawk cried out into the morning sky. Inside the cabin, 3 people, and 1 German shepherd, sat quietly in the presence of history finally being set right. And for the first time since his grandfather's death, Jack felt something crack open inside. A weight lifting. Not because he had kept the legacy, but because he had finally let it go. The sky over the Buckley cabin had turned a threatening steel grey, the kind of weight that made everything feel heavier, air, thoughts, decisions. Jack knew it wasn't just the storm rolling in from the mountains. Something else was coming. Ranger felt it too. He stood rigid by the front door, head tilted, ears sharp, body still as stone. His gaze never broke from the tree line. Claire peeked out from the kitchen window. "He's back," she whispered. Her voice carried the chill of truth. Croft, he hadn't come alone this time. 2 black SUVs crunched the gravel as they pulled up. Out stepped Croft, his tailored coat flapping in the wind, but there was nothing polished about his eyes now. They were hungry, desperate. Behind him were 2 armed men in tactical black, silent, broad-shouldered, hard eyes scanning the perimeter like they'd done this before. Jack opened the door slowly, Ranger by his side. "Jack," Croft said, too calmly. "Let's not drag this out. I know what you found. You know what I want. Hand over the case." Jack didn't blink. "You broke into my cabin. You tried to kill my dog. You think I'm just going to give it to you?" Croft laughed, low and dangerous. "You're ex-military. You know how this goes. You've got 10 seconds before I stop asking." Jack didn't answer. He looked at Ranger, then at Claire behind him. Time bent for a moment. He made his decision. "All right," he said. "Follow me." He led them inside, past the kitchen, down the hallway, and into the cold, musty cellar. The old wooden stairs groaned under their weight. Croft's men followed close behind, guns low but ready. Claire stayed upstairs, her hand clenched around the burner phone Jack had slipped her earlier, with one whispered command. "Call now." Jack stopped in front of a concrete wall with a hairline crack running vertically down the middle. Dust hung thick in the air. He motioned toward it. "Behind here." Croft nodded to one of his men, who stepped forward. Jack slowly pulled his pistol from under his flannel, pressed it against the man's chest, and fired. Not a live round, but a deafening blank. The echo exploded through the cellar like a grenade. In the chaos that followed, Jack dropped to the floor, grabbing Croft's gun hand as it instinctively swung around. They struggled. Wood splintered. Blood smeared across stone. And then came Ranger. The German shepherd launched from the shadows with a low, guttural snarl, intercepting the second bodyguard mid-step. His jaws clamped down on the man's wrist, forcing the gun to the floor with a clatter. The man screamed, twisting wildly, but Ranger held firm, teeth buried deep. Croft punched Jack hard in the ribs, but Jack rolled with it, using Croft's own momentum to slam him into the wall. The briefcase thudded onto the floor near the old wine rack. Claire burst into the cellar holding a shotgun she could barely balance. "Drop it!" she screamed. Her voice shook, but her eyes didn't. Croft's remaining bodyguard raised his hands. Outside, sirens wailed through the wind. The sheriff's convoy arrived with a fury. 3 cruisers, 2 deputies from the next county, and an unmarked vehicle carrying federal agents tipped off by Jack's anonymous drops over the last 2 days. They'd finally seen enough to believe him. The cellar filled with boots, shouts, drawn weapons. Croft's men didn't resist. They knew when the tide had turned. Croft didn't say a word as they cuffed him, but his eyes locked with Jack's one last time. There was no rage now, no smugness, only the dull confusion of a man who'd gambled everything and lost. Ranger stood over the fallen bodyguard, chest heaving, blood on his fur, but no wounds of his own. When the officer tried to pull him back, Ranger didn't move until Jack gave a quiet nod. Only then did he step aside. An EMT kneeled beside Jack, but he waved him off. He looked at Ranger, then at Claire. "You okay?" he asked. Claire nodded, tears brimming. "Are you?" Jack exhaled. "Now I am." The sheriff approached, eyeing the scene. "You had this planned, didn't you?" Jack looked around the ruined cellar, the broken wood, the spent casings, the briefcase still untouched. "Not all of it," he said, "but enough." One deputy opened the leather case. Inside, stacks of financial records, Swiss account transfers, contracts, evidence tying Croft to the decades-old cover-up and Mateo Reyes' murder. Then, resting on top, was a photograph. A man Jack had never met, smiling with a hand on a young boy's shoulder. Mateo. And the boy was Lucia's father. The truth was heavier than any file, but it had waited long enough. Jack looked down at Ranger, who was already watching him. "You knew," Jack whispered, "before I did." Ranger didn't move. He didn't have to, because loyalty doesn't bark, it acts. The courtroom was quiet as the judge set down the final file, removed his glasses, and looked toward Lucia Reyes. "In light of the evidence," he said, voice firm, "the estate of Mateo Reyes shall be returned to his rightful family. His name is cleared." Jack sat at the back of the room, a ghost among the living. No applause, no cheers, just the truth landing like a soft breath after a long sprint. Lucia turned slightly, meeting his gaze, and offered a small nod. Not of gratitude, not of pity, just acknowledgement, the kind shared by people who had both lost and found something in the same moment. Outside the courthouse, the air smelled of late summer dust and far-off monsoon rain. Jack knelt beside Ranger, who had waited patiently near the truck, watching everything, saying nothing. As always. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of Jack's boots, but he didn't rise. He didn't need to. "I guess we're done here," Jack murmured. Ranger exhaled, slow and steady, as if he agreed. The property, hundreds of acres of sun-bleached grassland and crumbling arroyos, was now under the name of the Reyes family. Lucia had asked Jack if he wanted to keep a portion. A small cabin, even a trailer. But Jack had shaken his head. He had already made his decision. Weeks later, he stood before the land once more, wind pulling at the edge of his jacket. He had signed the paperwork that morning. The entire area, all of it, was now in the hands of a non-profit land trust, set to become a conservation preserve. No luxury homes, no strip malls, just wind, sky, and whatever creatures still called it home. "I figured the coyotes deserved their peace," Jack had told the director of the trust. But it wasn't really about the coyotes. It was about leaving things better than he found them. Something Mateo might have understood. That afternoon, Jack and Ranger pulled off the dusty road in an old Ford truck that rattled like it had stories to tell. The rearview mirror swung with a faded ribbon tied there by a woman Jack barely remembered but would never forget. He drove with the windows down. Ranger lay in the bed of the truck, chin resting on his front paws, eyes scanning the horizon like always. But there was no threat left. Only road. They passed an old gas station, boarded up. A place where lies once sparked into fire. They passed the town limits sign, faded and rusted. Ranger's tail gave one slow thump against the truck bed. Jack didn't look back. Later that night, they camped near a dry riverbed miles from anywhere. Jack built a small fire and laid out a blanket for Ranger, even though the dog always ended up curled beside him anyway. He looked up at the stars and thought of his father, of the war, of the weight they had both carried, and how some things never really leave. They just quiet down. "Truth's out now," he said aloud. Not to Ranger, not to anyone, just to the night. Ranger stood up, walked to his side, and sat. Not stiff like a soldier, not guarded like a watchdog, just present, loyal. And Jack understood. He didn't need a home. He had Ranger. And that was enough. They stayed there, under the open sky, until the fire burned down to whispers. Somewhere out there, a man's name had been restored. A family had been returned what was stolen. A land had been saved from greed. And a bond between man and dog had endured everything. Fire, war, betrayal, and silence. Ranger didn't just bark at ghosts. He barked at lies, at danger, at injustice. And when the time came, he was quiet. Not because he had nothing to say, but because the truth didn't need volume. Just proof. As Jack packed up camp the next morning and Ranger jumped into the front seat this time, the truck door creaked shut with finality. A new road. A clean ledger. Not heroes, not legends. Just a man and his dog. And that's where we leave them, for now. But before you go, take a moment. Look beside you. Think of the companion who's never asked for anything but your presence, who's stood guard during your storms, who's walked beside you when the world turned its back. What's your story with a loyal pet? Share it in the comments. Like and subscribe if you believe loyalty still matters. This is the German Shepherd channel, where stories aren't just told, they're remembered.